be walking through how I made this Cinderella inspired reversible bodice and reversible dress. The bodice is my Betty pattern, which is available on my Etsy, and the dress, I mentioned a couple of patterns that you could use in the video, but since then I have released a dedicated pattern to this exact dress, which is called my Cindy pattern. Both of those patterns are available on my Etsy, which is linked below. I've tried to keep everything as beginner friendly as possible, and I think that's everything, so let's get on with the tutorial. So I'm going to start by working on this reversible bodice. So this is the fabric that I'm going to be using. I believe this is a poly cotton. I could have also used just standard cotton. You can also use linen. Anything that is a fabric without any stretch that isn't too bulky, because obviously it's a reversible project, so you don't want anything that is too thick. So polycotton, cotton and linen is probably what I would most recommend. I'm also going to be using some interfacing. This is fusible interfacing, so I'm going to take each piece that I cut out from my fabric and iron this onto it, just so that it has a little bit more structure. I'm also going to be using pins, some fabric scissors to cut out my pattern pieces, and some fabric pens to draw out my pattern pieces. In terms of my sewing machine, I'm just going to be using a regular machine with a straight stitch. The pattern that I'm going to be using for the bodice is my Betty pattern, and this has 3 pieces. So I have pattern piece 1, which is the center front, pattern piece 2, which is the side front, and pattern piece 3, which is the back. So I'm going to start to draw them out now, and I'm going to start on the blue side. So taking my blue fabric here, I'm going to fold that out, and I want to find the selvage edge, which is the bound edge that you'll find on 2 of the sides. You'll know the difference because this one will fray a lot easier. So now I'm going to take my 2 selvage edges, so my 2 bound edges, and lay them on top of each other like so. So now that I've got my fabric laid out with my 2 selvage edges on top of each other, and then I've got a fold down at this edge, I'm going to take my pattern pieces. So I'll start with my center front, and it has the grain line marked on here. So I want the grain line to lie parallel to the selvage edge. If you want to be more precise about this, you can take a tape measure and measure each point of that line to make sure it's nice and parallel. So I'm going to lay the center front there, and then I'm going to take the side front, and again that wants to be about parallel. I'm going to use this ruler because it will probably be a little bit easier. That is about right. And then the final piece, which is the back piece, is going to line up to the fold, which you won't be able to see just yet. So I'll draw these 2 in and get them cut out, and then I'll show you pattern piece 3. So now that I've got my first 2 pieces drawn out, I'm just going to take some pins and pin within those lines, just so that when I cut them out, I'm more likely to cut out 2 identical pieces. So now that I've got those pins in place, I'm going to cut them out with my fabric scissors, just taking my time to make sure I get both layers of fabric. So now that I've cut the first 2 out, I can just move this fabric up and you can see the fold a little bit easier. I have just pressed along this fold just to make this bit a little bit easier. So now I'm going to take pattern piece 3, and you can see here on the pattern there is an arrow that points to a fold. So you want to line this edge up to the fold and then just draw it out. The first 2 pieces you need 2 pieces of each one, but this one you only need 1. So that's why you cut this one out on the fold. And then the same as with the first 2, I'm just going to pin these 2 layers together and cut this piece out. So this is what I've got once everything is all cut out. So I'm just going to remove my pins. Like I said, you'll have 2 layers for the first 2 pieces and just 1 for the back piece. So 2 layers in the side piece, 2 layers in the front piece, and then the back piece just folds out to be one larger piece. So now I'm going to add my interface in. So I'm going to cut out all of the same pieces in these and iron them on. One thing that's really important here is that I need to make sure that when I'm adding the interface in, that I'm adding it in a way that I will have one piece for each side. So for example, on this piece, the interfacing will go behind it here, and then the interfacing will go behind this one here, because it's quite easy to forget and to just iron it on with both of them facing that way. So I will show you how I do my interfacing now. So I have my interfacing here, and I have the kind of rough side facing up, which is the side with the glue on, which is what I want. And then I'm going to take my two pieces for pattern 1 and lay them on top of here. Again, making sure that you have one facing in each direction. So because I'm not going to be laying them right next to each other, because I'm trying to fit them onto the interfacing, I'm going to lay them on top of each other and then flip and then rotate, so I know exactly which way I need each one to be facing. Obviously, this isn't a problem if you're using fabric with a right and wrong side. It's just that this fabric and a lot of the fabric that is probably going to be used for this kind of project will be the same on both sides. But if you do have a fabric with a right and wrong side, you can just use the interfacing on your wrong side. So that makes it a little bit easier. So now I'm just going to iron over the top of these so that they stick to the interfacing, and then I'm going to cut straight around the pattern piece. I'm just going to start to iron this in place. If you want to do this in the same way as me, where you're essentially ironing straight onto the interfacing, a good trick is to take some greaseproof paper and iron on top, just so that any parts that you're ironing around the fabric aren't going to stick to your iron, and then you can just peel it off. The other method, of course, is you can cut the interfacing out before you iron it on, but I find that this is a little bit more precise with getting your shapes and sizes exactly the same. So then you can peel off like that. That one is about done. I'm going to repeat the same for that one, and then I'm just going to cut straight around the edges. So this is how those two pieces look once they're all cut out. You can see the interfacing on that side. Now I'm going to go in and repeat the same process for the side pieces and the back piece, so adding interface into them, and then I'm going to go in and repeat all of the same steps for my brown pieces as well. So this is everything that I've got now that everything's cut out and everything has the interfacing pressed onto the back. So I'm going to start by making the blue side. So I'll start with the front piece and the side piece. So taking my two front pieces, I'm going to put these together, but just before I do that, I'm going to take the pattern piece for this front piece, and I'm just going to pierce a hole through the marks that show me where my eyelets should go. And now I'm just going to flip that so that it matches the orientation of the piece that I've got, and I'm going to use my fabric pen just to mark those points in place. This just means that when it gets to the end, it's going to be a lot easier to add my eyelets in. So just leave in a small mark at each point. You will only need to do this on one of your fabrics, so I'm only going to do this on the blue side, because sometimes you can find that the eyelets won't match up perfectly if you do them on both sides. So just mark them out on one of your fabrics. So now that I've done that, I'm just going to take this side piece and lay it together with this one with right sides facing together. I'm going to take my pins and pin along this edge here. You will have to manipulate these two pieces a little bit because obviously it's two curved edges trying to fit together. But I'm just going to move the pin a bit further away from the edge so that I can leave the pin in when I'm sewing this section. So now that I've got that all pinned in place, I'm going to sew along this edge with a straight stitch and about 1 centimetre of seam allowance. I'm just going to place this under my needle, try and find about where 1 centimetre would be, and then I'm just going to follow along this seam here. Just making sure that I reverse at the end. Just going to move any pins that I think are going to be in the way. I'm just taking my time with this. And again, just reversing at this end. So this is how that should look once it is sewn together. When you open it out, it looks like this. I'm just going to lay it out flat and press this seam open with my iron. So I'm going to use my greaseproof paper again. Just fold that seam out and then gradually press it in place. This is quite awkward to do and it definitely won't come out perfect, like you'll get quite a few folds here and there, but once you start to wear the bodice in and it kind of stretches with your body, those will all go away. So I've just finished pressing that in place. I definitely didn't do a large enough seam allowance for parts of it. It should be okay. And then once you turn it around, it looks like this. And I've just gone in and repeated that for all of my remaining pieces in these 2 pattern pieces, so including the brown fabric as well. So I have a matching piece in the brown as well. You want one in each orientation for this, and then I'm going to lay them right sides facing together, and I'm just going to pin around the edge. I'm going to pin everywhere except along this straight edge here and this straight edge at the top. So armholes, bottom of the bodice, the front of the bodice where the lacing is going to go, and then the neckline here. I'm just going to pin around all of those areas. So that's how that looks with all the pins in place, and I'm going to follow around with my sewing machine and stitch a straight stitch all the way around this edge with a 1 centimetre seam allowance, again just leaving open this top of the strap here and then this side here, so sewing everywhere other than those 2 areas. So this is how that looks once the 2 pieces are sewn together, and now I'm just going to take my scissors and go around those edges and just cut some small triangles out up to that seam line. This is just going to make sure that these seams fit a bit better to the curves of your body and that they don't, these actual seams don't stick out too much. I'm just going to cut all the way around all of those seams, making sure that I get all of the corners as well. And then once I've done that, it will look something like this. So I've got all my triangles cut out around the edges, and obviously I've got 2 of these as well, so I've repeated that for all of my pieces. And now I'm just going to turn this to the right side out. So that's how that looks once it's turned to the right side out. I am going to just press this so it sits a little bit flatter, and then repeat this for the other piece, turning that to the right side out. And then I'm going to put these to one side and work on the back piece. So now moving on to my back piece, I'm going to do something very similar to what I just did with the other pieces. I'm just going to lay them one on top of the other with right sides facing together. And I'm going to pin around the edges again. So I'm going to pin along this bottom edge, along the armholes here, and along the neckline, or the back of the neckline at the top here. So I'm going to be leaving open the top of the straps again, and also the sides, pretty much the same as what I just did on the other pieces. And now that I've got those pins in place, I'm just going to sew around those edges with a straight stitch and 1 centimetre seam allowance again. So just around this edge here, the armholes and the bottom of the bodice, leaving out these straight edges here and these straight edges at the top of the straps. So I've just finished sewing around those edges, and now I'm going to go in and do the same thing as I did on the front and side piece. I'm going to take my scissors and just cut some triangles around these edges. I'm just going to continue doing that around all the edges that I just sewed. So I've just finished cutting out around these edges, and now I'm going to grab my 2 front pieces back. And these front pieces are the right way out, and my back piece is still inside out. And my goal here is to put these pieces inside here so that the side seam matches up inside here and the strap matches up inside here. So something that's important here as well is to make sure that the right fabrics are facing each other. So here I've got the blue facing up and I've got the blue at the top here, so they're facing each other. I'm just going to put this inside here. I'm going to start by matching up the strap. So just pull the strap up there and then just match up that straight edge. And I'm going to pin that in place. And now that I've got that strap pinned in place, I'm going to do the same thing with this side seam. So just pinning that straight edge inside the straight edge here. So that's how that looks once this is pinned in place. And now I'm just going to kind of fold the rest of that top out of the way so that I can add the other piece. At this point, you can decide to do it one at a time if you want and just sew these in place before you add the second one, because it can be a little bit awkward. But I'm just going to do both of mine at the same time. So I'm literally just going to repeat the exact same step with this piece. So now that I've got both of my front pieces pinned in here, it will be quite bulky. Now I'm just going to sew along these edges with my straight stitch and a 1 centimeter seam allowance again. So just straight across the top of the straps and then down the sides as well. Just making sure to get all 4 layers of fabric in the stitch. So I've just finished sewing those seams in place. I just made sure that wherever I was adding a new stitch line, I matched it up to the previous stitch lines that I put in place. So for example here, I matched it up to this bottom edge and also to the armhole here. So now I just need to turn this to the right side out. So I'm just going to unpick a small hole along this bottom section here. Now that I've got my hole, I'm just going to use that to gently push the bodice through to the right side. So once you've got that pulled through to the right hand side, I would just recommend checking those seams that you just sewed, so just down the sides and at the top of the straps, just to make sure you haven't missed any of your layers. But it looks like mine is okay. So now I just need to close up this hole at the bottom. So you have a couple of options here. The first one is if you want to add a top stitch, you can fold this hole in on itself and just sew straight over the top with a straight stitch. If I was doing a top stitch, I would just come all the way around the outer perimeter and then around the armhole. But I'm not going to add a top stitch to this one just because my 2 fabrics are such different colours. So I couldn't really do anything that's going to match both of them particularly well. So that's one way that you can close up the hole, is with a top stitch. If you don't want to do a top stitch, you can close it up with a ladder stitch by hand, which is what I'm going to do. For my ladder stitch, I'm just going to fold these edges back in on themselves, and then I'm going to do 1 stitch on the brown side and then come over and do 1 stitch on the blue side, trying to keep that as parallel as possible, and then back over to the brown side and back over to the blue. So I'm just going to keep doing that along the length of the hole, and then I'm going to come back on myself and tie it off over here so that I have a double stitch over this area to make it more secure. And then once that hole is closed up at the bottom, the only thing left to do is to add the eyelets. And this is the kit that I'm going to use, and use this with a hammer. I'm not going to do it on camera because it can be very, very noisy. So you just take this piece out of here and line that up under wherever you want to add your eyelet, and then take this side, place that on top of your mark, and then hit that with a hammer around 3 or 4 times normally does the job. And then once you have your hole, you place your eyelet under there, and then the top of the ring on top, and then again just hit that with your hammer. Obviously for this part you can just follow whatever the instructions are for whichever kit you are using to add all your eyelets, and then this part is done. So now I'm going to move on to make the reversible dress. I'm going to be using this turquoisey kind of colour and a brown for this side, and then just a baby blue for this side. So these are the fabrics that I'm going to be using. They are all 95% cotton, 5% elastane. They are all 4-way stretch, and they are all from Minerva. So for this project you would want to look for something with a 4-way stretch, anything that's similar to a 95% cotton, 5% elastane or spandex. I'm also going to be using some pins, some fabric scissors to cut out my pattern pieces, some fabric pens to draw out my pattern pieces, and some flat braided elastic. This is optional, but it will give the top a bit of extra structure, and this is about 5 to 6 millimeters wide. In terms of my sewing machine, I'm going to be using an overlocker for this whole project, but you could also use a regular machine with zigzag stitch. I'm going to be using 2 different patterns for this piece. So the first one is my Lola pattern, and I'm going to be using the scoop neck side of the top, the high neck side of the top, the pocket piece, and the skirt piece, which I have cut to the knee length section. I did draw this as though I was going to use the mini section, but I think I'm going to go in and do it on the knee length one. And when I cut these out, I'm going to cut them with this edge lined up to a fold so that this piece becomes twice as large. And then I'm also going to be adding my puff sleeve pattern, which you can find in my sleeve bundle, or you can also buy it on its own. So I'm going to be using this as well. So now I'm going to go ahead and cut all of my pieces out off camera, and then I'll come back and show you what you would need in each piece. So I've just finished cutting everything out. These are my sleeves that I've cut out. So I've cut out 2 in each colour fabric, 2 in the green and 2 in the blue. So now the first thing I'm going to do is cut them down the centre. So I've just finished cutting them all in half. I did that by folding them in half, is normally the easiest way to do it. Now I'm going to take each of these pieces, should have 8 in total now, and along the top I'm going to sew a straight stitch close to this top edge all the way along here, just making sure not to secure it at either end because we're going to be using that to gather. And then along this bottom edge I'm going to do the same thing with a straight stitch, but I'm going to do it about 2 inches above that bottom edge. So I'm going to do across here with a straight stitch, and again not securing it at either end. So I'm going to do that for all 8 pieces. I will give you an example of doing that as well, and you can do this with a hand stitch as well if you want to. So I've just got my regular machine set up here with ordinary thread through the top, and then I'm going to be using elastic thread in the bobbin. So this is going to allow me to keep a lot of the stretch from the sleeves. It's up to you whether you want to do that or not, but I would recommend it. So I've just put my elastic on here by hand. You don't want to use your machine to wind this on, and then just load that up as normal. And then just taking one of my half sleeves, I'm going to start by going around the top edge as close as I can. Just make sure that the machine is on a straight stitch. Just remembering not to secure the ends, so not reversing or anything like that. And keep those edges nice and long so that I can use them together. And then I'm going to do the same with the bottom edge, but for this edge I'm going to do it about 2 inches above the bottom edge rather than sticking close to the edge like I did for the top one. And then again, not securing any of those ends. So that's how my half sleeve is looking. I'm going to repeat that for all of my other pieces now. So once I've finished sewing these lines in place, I'm just going to bring back my sleeve pattern, which I have folded in half. And you should be able to see that there's 2 lines here that are in bold. So now that is the amount that I need to gather the sleeve to make it fit to these lines. So it's a little bit too big at the moment. So I'm just going to pull on some of these strings to get it together. If you use elastic for your bobbin thread, it's easier to pull that one. So I'm literally just going to pull that thread and gather the sleeve more than it already is. And then I'm just going to keep checking it against the guide. Still need a little bit more. I'm going to come from the other side. So that looks about right, matching up with this bold line here. And then I'm going to do the same with this top section to get that to be the same length. And then once I've done that, I'm just going to tie off the ends for each one, just to make sure it doesn't come undone or doesn't gather anymore. So I'm going to do that for all 8 pieces of my sleeves. So now that I've finished gathering all of my sleeves, I'm just going to talk through which pieces I've got for each side of the dress. So for the blue side, and this is the front of the dress, I've got 1 piece for the skirt, and this, like I said, was cut out on a fold to make it twice as wide. I've got 1 piece for the scoop neck of this side, 2 pockets, and then 2 sleeves, but obviously these were cut down the middle of the pattern, so they are both a half sleeve. And then for the back of the blue side, it's almost exactly the same. So I've got my 1 skirt piece that was folded in half, my 2 pocket pieces, my 2 half sleeves, and then for my top, I've got the higher neck side. So that is all for the back of the blue side. So then this is the front of the green side. So I have my 1 skirt piece that was cut on a fold, my 2 pocket pieces, I have 1 piece for the scoop neck side of the top, and then I have my 2 pieces of the half sleeves that I've gathered as with the others. And then for the back of the green side, it's very similar again. I have the 1 piece of the skirt which was cut on a fold, I have my 2 pocket pieces, I have 1 piece of my higher neck side of the top, and then I have my 2 half sleeves as well. So now I'm going to go in and start to sew all of these pieces together how I've got them laid out here. I'm going to do the same for each 4 pieces that I've shown. So what I'm going to do for this part is I'm just going to take the pieces and place them right sides facing together, and then use my pins to pin them in place. So starting by pinning the top to the skirt. So then I've got my top pinned to the top of my skirt there. So I'm going to sew across that with my overlocker. You can use a zigzag stitch as well. And then once you fold that up, it will be attached as you need it to. And then I'm also going to do the same thing with my sleeves. So just taking them right sides together and pinning around that armhole. And then again, once that's pinned on, you can fold that out and see how it's supposed to look. Again, I'm going to sew that with my overlock. I'm just going to repeat that for the other sleeve as well. But then once you have the sleeves in place, you can also add the pockets. I'm going to do this after I've sewn this edge in place. So I'm going to sew the top to the skirt, and then after that, I'm going to pin these just lining up with the seam there to the side of the skirt. I'm just going to do it now so that I can show how it's going to look. So that's just pinned in place, lined up to the seam between the top and the skirt. And you can fold that out again. And obviously you want to do the same for the other pocket, and that will look something like that. So I'm going to go in and sew all of those seams in place with my overlocker. Again, you can use a zigzag stitch, and then I'm going to repeat that for every other kind of panel that I've got. So I'll have a front and back for the green side, and also a front and back for Cinderella's side that I need to sew to be one panel like this. So I've just gone ahead and sewn all of my panels together so that I have 4 pieces that look like this. I've got my pockets attached, my tops attached, and my sleeves attached. So my 4 pieces, I've got one for the front of the blue, one for the back of the blue, one for the front of the green and brown, and one for the back of the green and brown. So now I'm going to start to attach those sides together. So I'm going to take my front of the blue side, which is the scoop neck, and the same piece in the green and brown piece, and I'm going to lay them one on top of the other with right sides facing together. So this is my green piece. I'm going to just lay that right sides together. Start to match up these corresponding edges. So now I'm going to start to pin these 2 layers together in a few different places. So I'm going to pin along this bottom edge of the sleeve. I will have to kind of stretch things about to get that to fit. I'm going to pin along this bottom edge, and the same on the other side of the sleeve. I'm going to pin right around this neckline and then all the way along the bottom of the skirt. I'm going to do that off camera, and then I'll show you properly each part that I've pinned when I've done it. So I've just finished pinning those 4 edges in place. So I've got the bottom of my sleeve on each side pinned in place, around my neckline, and then also straight along this bottom edge of my skirt. So now I'm going to go in with my overlocker and sew along each of those edges that I've pinned in place. You can also use a zigzag stitch. So now that I have my neckline sewn in place, I'm just going to take some of my flat braided elastic and lay that on top of that neckline seam. So I'm just going to lay that straight on top of the seam and sew it on top with my overlocker. Again, you can use a zigzag stitch as well. I'm just going to use this finger to guide it round without stretching it. So that should look something like this. So I've got all of those edges sewn in place now, the bottom of each sleeve, around this neckline, and I've added my elastic there as well, and then also along this bottom edge of the skirt. I'm going to take this piece and turn it to the right side out. So I have my front piece the right way out, and then I've just repeated all the same steps for my back pieces as well, but these ones I'm going to keep inside out. So I'm just going to place this one on the bottom. As you can see, this one's still inside out, but I've sewn all the same edges in place. So at the bottom of the sleeves, around the neckline, and I added the elastic there, and then around the bottom edge of the skirt. So now I'm going to take my front piece, which is the right way out, and I'm going to place it inside this back piece, which is inside out. And I'm going to make sure that the right fabric is facing the right fabric. So here I've got the blue side facing up, and I've got the blue side facing up of the back piece, and that means that when I start to put this inside here, the blue is facing the blue, the brown is facing the brown. So I'm just going to put this inside this one and match up all of the corresponding edges. So this is how it looks once my piece that is the right way out is lined up inside this piece. So I have 4 layers of fabric here, and I've just pinned along all the edges. So pinning through 4 layers of fabric all the way along. So I've done along the top of the strap and the top of the sleeve here, along the side of the sleeve and down the side of the top, along the top of the pocket, around the pocket, and then straight down this side of the skirt. And obviously I've done the same on the other side. So now I'm going to go in and follow all of those edges with my overlocker. You can also use a zigzag stitch as always. So I've just finished sewing around all of my edges. The puff sleeves were quite tricky to go around. I've never made reversible puff sleeves before, so I think I might have missed some layers at some point, but I can go in and fix that afterwards. So now I'm just going to unpick a hole in the pocket so that I can turn this to the right side out. So now that I have this seam unpicked slightly, I'm just going to use that to turn this to the right side out. This is what the dress looks like once it's turned to the right side out. I have just gone in and checked all of my seams to check that there aren't any places that I've missed out a layer. There are a couple of places that I'm going to just do a little bit of hand sewing to make sure all the seams are in place. I think the sleeves are mostly okay. So now all I need to do is close up this hole here, and I'm going to do that with a ladder stitch by hand. So for my ladder stitch, I'm just going to fold the seam in on itself. I'm going to do 1 stitch on one side of the hole and then come over as parallel as possible to do a stitch on the other side. And then back to the first side and then over again to the other side. So I'm going to keep doing that along the length of the hole. So I'm going to come all the way down here and then I'm going to come all the way back again so that I have a double stitch layer, and then I'm going to tie it off at the top. So then now that I've got this hole all sewed up, the dress is finished and I can try everything on together.